So today was supposed to be, according to our canvas, it was supposed to be Dr. Surgeon's class, but she has a lecture. So I'm gonna record it so she can also watch it. And I hope y'all have read the readings, but that's not the only thing we're gonna talk about today. I decided to make some changes. So you may have explained to you all, I'm from China. I came to the United States in 2013. And also for this class, I don't have a lot of information. Well, I don't have a lot of things for you to take down, so you don't have to take notes. You can just listen. There may be a couple books that may be interesting to you. And hopefully you can take that down. And I would ask you to do me a favor for not doing anything that is distracting, because I like to look at these whole time. So, okay, going back to my original comments. So I came here in 2013, but before that, I grew up in an urban city in China called Dalian, and I studied in Beijing for my college degree, undergrad in viticulture enology, which is fruit growing and winemaking. So it was in the food science engineering department. And then I went to France and then went to Europe. I realized this, the technology aspect is not the only thing that is interesting to me. And in fact, I don't really like working in the lab. I don't like to take precise data and compare them and calculate that error margin. So I wanted to study all the different cultures that came to the United States. If you're gonna talk, will you please go out to talk if you're going to talk? Okay. So as I was come to America, I started to study anthropology, and the first thing I did was in craft beer, because I was in Mississippi and there wasn't much of a wine. And then for my PhD, I did tea in China. So my focus, I'm a cultural anthropologist. So my focus is on food and taste and in different cultures, particularly in China, a little bit about America, because I studied craft beer in America, which I realized I didn't really like how beer tasted. I was a little afraid that it may make my informants upset when I'm not that into beer. But anyway, so Dr. Surgeon asked me to do this lecture. I have to say I'm not an expert in medicine. I did not study medical anthropology in particular, but I did grow up in China. I have visited the doctors. I have seen the massive changes that occurred in China. And our family has close friends who are doctors. So I definitely can tell you something you don't know. But we just also know I have my limitations. I have my bias. Like everything we discussed, we learned, there are bias attached to scholars and just people in general. So I also want to use this opportunity to address some things that are kind of personal to me for the last couple of years, being a Chinese in America. I came in 2013 and I was in Mississippi, a college town that doesn't have many Chinese people. And it was actually okay. Well, I was very curious about Americans, didn't know anything about China, so I can show people the cool stuff about China. I can much easier parse through and say, this is the government. And I was actually pretty critical of the Chinese government, because I used to be more patriotic because I grew up in that culture and I was educated to love my country, to agreeing with certain things where I didn't know there were alternatives. And as I became more aware of the other cultures and the other ways and certain alternatives of the ideologies, I became more critical about it. But that doesn't mean that I think everything China does is bad. I think everything that is attached to China is outrageous, and which is kind of how I feel recently of how the popular media, how the comments that has been innocently passed around. Like I would listen to a podcast that supposedly are the scholars who study China and the trading history, and then they would make like inside jokes, like laughing. This is a pretty good podcast that I listen to quite often. And they will laugh on them among themselves when they talk about China and foreign policy, like it's a joke. And people would randomly make jokes about Marxism, like you should burn the Communist Manifesto. It's like something people bonding over here in a difficult time. Usually back then, before pandemics, I was more okay with that. But it required, now that I realize it required a tremendous effort on my part to not be offended. I don't know if any of you have any experience being very different from a group that you're in, or some of the comments that people are making, maybe you're a woman and guys are making comments like the other day, the guy made a comment about women, and I just, there are things where we're becoming incredibly tense in our situation because it is a stressful situation, and some people decided that they're going to be more closed up, and I can understand that, but it also is incredibly hurtful for me at this point. I'm just tired of constantly explaining myself. It actually took me a long time to think about what I'm going to say to this class, which last semester, when Caroline asked me to just talk in the class about this section, I didn't think much. I thought for a while, and I came and I spoke. And then I ended up got really upset in the end when I was reading the last final paper that y'all do. So I hope you don't do this to me again. So the article we're supposed to read today is very critical about the privatization process, which we're going to talk a little bit more later. But in the end, you will notice there's a section that addresses China's efforts in changing the situation. So in that essay, this person did not completely ignore the last section, portray China as this static, screwed up country that just stuck and destroyed anything was good, and that's where it was left. And I was very upset about it. So hopefully you wouldn't do that to me again. I just ask you to be aware of the environment, the general comments discourse that is circulating around us, because I know it's not any of y'all's fault that has been like this. And as we're seeing in the Bending the Arc, remember Jim Kim was making the comment, he said he was interested in philosophy and politics, and his dad, and he wasn't Chinese. And his dad was commenting to him, was like, "You're a Chinaman." He was afraid. That's all the same back then. Nobody will listen to you. So I guess we did make some progress. Now you're listening to me. Even though I'm not a doctor, I didn't work incredibly hard to be in medical school. I worked hard, but I didn't go to medical school. So, and hopefully we have let you know throughout this course that, there are biases around us in the things that we didn't have to think twice about. Like if you're going to be a doctor someday, hopefully you'll be a little more sympathetic toward your patients. And hopefully you're more aware of the larger structural bias we talked about. So as you're starting to read the Kalinick book, dying and all this stuff, he recounts his experience as being a doctor, which he was trying to be very sympathetic, but it's not until that he had cancer himself that you realize how it feels to be on the other side. And I have to say, I didn't feel this way before. I was a little not that sympathetic toward people who are getting offended all the time, even when the argument seems, or the comment seems pretty innocent. But now, as I'm in this new state, I start to feel things, okay, some of the reactions are not directly related to that particular comment you're making, but it's relating to a larger picture that kind of just become incredibly frustrating. So I would just ask you to pay attention to that as we, I don't know, as you continue your life. When I was your age, it was how many years ago? 13 years ago. It was 2008, and things were quite different. I was in Beijing, and I was serving as a volunteer for Samsung for the Olympic Games. I was welcoming athletes from all over the world. People seemed to be hopeful, and China started to be wealthier. There's more opportunities, and now we're caught in this pandemic, and everybody's frustrated. So I don't know how this would affect you, as now you're in your early 20s, and how it would affect your future. But I hope you could just be a little more aware. As anthropologists, we try to understand agriculture, but we mess up. Like if you have taken intro to culture class, you would know the first part of the anthropological work was to endorse and give information to the imperialistic quest of the West, and there are a lot of gaze toward the other. So we're learning about these cultures, but you have to understand culture is not static. It's not just, and I know these are basic stuff, but I just felt I need to repeat it. It's not static, and any information that we get is only a very limited snapshot of what really is going on. So please don't feel like you know enough to make a very strong argument. I know that's part of how it feels like to be academia, but to be in the academic world, a lot of people do that, and a lot of times the politicians do that. They don't know any better, but they make very strong extremist comments, which will elicit, which will cause a lot of people to rally behind. But I think it is much more valuable, especially in current world, to have a more complex view. It may be very difficult to understand for other people to understand you. It is much more nuanced, but I think it's very valuable. It's a more difficult thing to do. So I hope you can do that and just keep that in mind as we go along. And realize that even if you learned it in the class, you read it in the academia journal, that doesn't mean the person who are writing it is completely objective, completely impartial. And in this time, I think being impartial itself is kind of privilege, because, for example, I didn't want to feel all these things, but I don't have the luxury of being impartial. Okay, so today we'll do a couple things. So first, we'll talk about the reading just a little bit, but then we're going to view a clip, which is a kind of a promotional clip from CGPN, but I felt like to counter argue some of the things that didn't get addressed in the article, and also it's a much newer, updated view. It didn't take into consideration of the COVID, but there are a lot of things need to be concluded before we can say for certain, with more certainty, what is going on, I feel. And so we're gonna watch these video clips, and then I'll give you some of my personal experiences, my personal comments on that. And then lastly, I want to talk about some of the philosophies regarding medicine and the practices in China that is very different from America. So, and talk a little bit about the Chinese medical anthropologists writing and scholarship, because it's not available in English. And I think it would be very interesting to know. And if you have something that you feel relevant, you want to comment on, feel free to raise your hand. So first, the privatization and its discontent, the evolving Chinese healthcare system. So originally, this lecture is supposed to be on Wednesday, and Caroline was going to talk about the healthcare in China before the privatization period as more of a model that the WHO was promoting for developing countries. So this is a little This is a little unorthodoxical how we're doing this time, but she has to go, so we're gonna talk about this first. But keep in mind what I'm saying when Caroline is giving the lecture on Wednesday. So in that article, you see it addresses a lot of the problems because of the privatization. So I think the authors are reasonably very frustrated because they thought, what was really working with China for changing a lot of the very devastating health issues in China. But you have to also keep in mind this is so the healthcare model, the commune, the barefoot doctors, which we probably will see some video clips in the next lecture. Those were only like in the 50s. So in the beginning of the 20th century, China was still in very, very much more hellish environment. There was war, there was the civil war, the government, there was like severe inflations, and when I was a child, I didn't want to watch any TV shows or movies that set in that era because I knew, like everybody that you care about as you're watching a movie, eventually it's gonna die or be tortured or something will happen. It was a really bad period of time. So it was very effective what they did to establish that the barefoot doctor, like a government, more centralized government controlled model to kind of a little similar to what we see in the Bending the Arc, the health partnering health type of model that you go to the people in the village. Is a very grounded kind of approach. But so in the article, I think the authors are very upset that this was completely dismantled. Well, but because as a lot of the issues that in the beginning of the PRC was getting a lot better. Now there are other issues that people feel that was more pressing to take care of. So as you start to see less of death and infant mortality, you started to shift it to more chronic diseases. And also there are a lot of people. Okay, so the environment, the context before privatization is that everybody is equally poor. No one has really any money. But then as things develop, things get a little better. Now there is an incentive for people to get money. So the policy started changing. So the port cities in the East Coast started to get rich. And now you start to see the wealth disparity. I think if you ask the Chinese people, people would, in general, if you do a census in China, a lot of people would still want China to be wealthier than continue that old mode, even though it works to some extent. There are a lot more information you need to, context you need to take into consideration. And I would also say a lot of things were not as bad as they're describing in that article. I understand that, when you're writing an article, when you're doing research, there are individual cases you can't take into consideration, but I didn't think it was as bad. But that is not to deny that privatization did cause very serious issues. So like they said, it could in certain areas, or because the scale is so big, China has way more population than America. So certain unintended consequences are very different, very different. Like for example, the rural and the urban disparity. I grew up in urban China, so I can't really speak for people from rural part of China. That changed the transition period, which the article was written in 2005. So China is still dealing with all these issues in terms of the coverage, health coverage for the rural part of people, like what is put in place to replace a barefoot doctor that was still in the development. But my father, he did come from a very, very poor part of China. So this is my personal experience. It may not line up with everybody's experience, but he joined the military and he went on and moved into a city and married my mom. But his dad, my grandparents and their 6 kids, 6 other kids and all their grandchildren, like a pretty large family, they stayed in rural part of China, where in the early 2000s, when I went back, the electricity is still very unstable. It still goes out from time to time, no internet whatsoever back then. Well, but today they probably have internet, they probably have smartphone, like just to show you how fast it changes. So you can't really think in terms of American development that this is what should have been done. So anyway, my point is that my grandparents, they did have some disease that needed to be attended. My grandma has a cataract, like things on your eyes, yeah. Okay, so she, they did have insurance coverage. I don't quite really understand how it works, but they did have health insurance. They could afford it. And also when they address that, you know, the percentage of out of pocket people are paying, yes, it is much higher. But you also have to keep in mind that in America, things are just so outrageously expensive. The medicines are more expensive, the visits are more expensive. So for example, I have my, so in 2007, I went to college and education is much cheaper. My semester's fee is $1,000. That's all, and the food are really cheap. And I didn't even know I actually had insurance coverage. Well, I knew later, but I wasn't like paying particularly a category $500 for insurance coverage. I think it was just lumped in my tuition, which is $1,000. And I had to get my teeth fixed one time. I didn't know, I thought I didn't need to get my teeth fixed. So I had to like, what is the thing, like a filling in my teeth? And guess how much it cost me? Nobody?
$1 million.
Thank you. It was like $8. So because it was 90% compensated by the government or something. And then, okay, later it did get more expensive. As I graduated, I had a couple teeth pulled out, but it was like maybe $100. And then recently I got my teeth pulled out in America. It was just, I was lucky that I got to do it in China. So, and you also, if you ever had the Chinese friends or international friends, we have this joke. So if you ever fainted in America, you have an emergency, last thing you say is that do not put me on an ambulance because it was so expensive, which really did happen to me. So I had an accident in 2015 when I was driving, which is why I don't drive as much anymore. And I actually kind of lost my memory, had amnesia for a couple of minutes. So I think people think I was not myself, which was reasonable. But I remembered that I did not want to get on the ambulance because I didn't want to pay for it. And it was really ridiculous. Like for whatever reason, they called the hospital. I was perfectly fine, but they called the hospital to say there's an emergency. So they prepared an operational room that I never used because I was fine once they see me in person. I don't know why the paramedic people could not communicate that with them. So then they charged me $10,000 for something that I didn't use. Luckily, I was making little enough that the hospital decided to waive it. But that is to say there are a lot more context to it. Any questions? This part? So for, however, when I did get my teeth fixed, I felt like I didn't know enough to prepare to like keep my teeth in check. Like we didn't have this habit of going to see dentist every time, all the time. not every, like every year. So when you do get to see them, there's a severe issue that you need to attend it. So there are a lot of things relating to the chronic disease because we didn't have a lot of experience to deal with it. A lot of it is unintended consequences because of really fast growth in economy. So this is a little anecdotal, but because I didn't do research on that, but a lot of kids in early 2000s and 2010s got blood cancer, and people didn't know why. And then they started to research it more, and they find out it's because people having more money to spend, so they wanted new apartments, and then they wanted to decorate. A lot of the furnitures and the decoration, interior decorations they're using was emitting this poisonous gas that are children are particularly vulnerable. And I would also say that we didn't spend nearly as much money on cancer. Again, there are a lot of other things to prioritize it, which it wasn't just a priority. It wasn't like the infant mortality that was very pressing. It wasn't like people were starving. So a lot of people in China, when they find out they have cancer, it's too late. Usually, people coming kind of like if you think about DONCA, and like people always come in too late after they tried everything else. But I would say it is changing. It is getting a little better, but cancer is a very difficult thing for people in China. So then this would relate back to what I'm going to talk in the last little bit, is about how people are trying very hard as an individual to avoid things like cancer, even though there's no like large centralized campaign as much to any and research as in the United States to prevent cancer, but there is a lot of individual efforts to keep yourself healthy. And there's also a lot of information available for people to know how to take care of themselves. So that's what I wanted to say about the privatization and the article. And then we're going to watch this clip from CGTN.
Hey, how are you?
I'm fine.
You look good. I'm fine as well. Hey, buddy, how are you?
I'm fine.
How are you? I bet the phrase "I'm fine" is one of the first things you learn when you study English.
Fine.
Fine, good. But saying it right after you leave the hospital is expensive. People know this because everybody can say, "Hey, Siri, how are you?"
Hey, I can't complain.
I can't complain. Well, yeah, of course you can't complain. You're just software.
Medicare reform bill is on its way to President to celebrate final.
Right now, in my home country, American politicians are arguing over what is the best medical insurance. And it goes nowhere, even though there's dire need for reform. How the government will regulate and disseminate medical insurance is one of the biggest concerns among Americans. Because right now, most can't afford it. So how does China make it possible for 1.4 billion citizens to get health coverage? Let's go find out.
Healthcare system is very complicated system.
That is an important issue that all governments are struggling with.
With a population of 1.4 billion, Chinese hospitals treat about 8 billion patients per year. To tackle the global challenge posed by medical insurance, China firmly believes that an all-around moderately prosperous society cannot be achieved without the people's all-around health. Public health should be given priority in the country's development strategy.
We understand that this is a human right, that people have the right to be healthy.
In China, the healthcare system is built especially for the rural area, all the people are covered by the basic health insurance. China created a very unique primary care system.
In China, it's marvelous that I don't have to buy a cup of coffee before being allowed to use the washroom. Not only in the big cities, but in the countryside as well. In the small villages, there are well-equipped washrooms prepared for everyone. In the larger areas of the countryside, they're upgrading the washroom system. Like China's basic medical insurance system that covers everybody. These small but beautiful conveniences are available, and the best part is free for me. The most convenient thing is that you don't have to feel embarrassed when you're in a hurry. Excuse me. Thank you.
Toilets are a key indicator in measuring the advancement of a country, and their improvement will directly affect public health. In China, a toilet revolution is sweeping across the country. In 1993, the first rural environment health investigation revealed that only 7.5% of the rural areas in China have toilets. By the end of 2016, the figure had gone up to 80.3%, and China's target is to reach 85% by 2020. The introduction of the toilet revolution harmlessly processes excrement, which effectively kills bacteria and parasites in the excrement, and reduces the breeding of flies and mosquitoes. The oral fecal route transmission incidence rate in project areas has thus dropped significantly from 37.5 to 22.2 per 100,000 people, among which the percentage of dysentery, typhoid fever, and hepatitis A patients dropped by 35.2%, 25.1%, and 37.3%. Consequently, epidemic-prone diseases are prevented and controlled right from the start, and the overall medical expenses reduced. Like the universal medical insurance, the measure improves the health condition of the Chinese people and prevents the occurrence of diseases. The basic medical insurance system of China is the largest in the world. In addition to covering the employed urban population, it takes care of the urban unemployed and rural population, effectively safeguarding the health of the Chinese people. In 2017, the average life expectancy of the Chinese people reached 76.4%, rising to 40th place globally to becoming one of the fastest ascending countries. The Lancet, an internationally renowned medical journal, has ranked China among the top 5 countries in the world with the greatest medical advancement, which contributes largely to the country's medical reform.
Basically, we have two insurance, workers' insurance and the residence insurance. Workers' insurance is mainly paid by the employer, and the residence insurance are mainly paid by the government. Right now, the target is we're trying to achieve is let individuals out-of-pocket payment less than 30%.
Almost all governments then ask their population to cover a part of the costs that they, out of their own pocket. WHO suggests a standard and that cost sharing should not exceed 20%.
Despite the rising health spending as a share of GDP in China and the fall in personal health spending in the total health expenditure each year, China still lags behind. Compared to the US in 2017, China's total health expenditure amounted to 6.2% of its GDP and about $560 per capita, whereas that of the US amounted to 16.2% of its GDP and about $9,500 per capita. China's health spending per capita equates to only about 1/17 to 1/18 that of the US. Globally, in 2014, the average world health spending as a share of GDP already reached 9.9%, whereas China has yet to reach this figure even today. In 2018, the Lancet Healthcare Access and Quality Index ranked China 48th in the world, rising 13 places from the previous year, but the country must continue its hard work.
On the one hand, China ranks 48. On the other hand, if you look at the band in which China is sitting for its level of health expenditure, it is among the highest. In one of the graphs, it's even the highest achiever with the highest performance.
I think Chinese healthcare system still have a lot of problem to fix. Given such huge population, now people, their living standard is increasing, they want a much better, high quality healthcare.
The film generated heated debate in China. It tells the story of a small pharmacy owner traveling alone to India to buy cheap pirated drugs to help leukemia patients who can't afford the patented drugs. In China, certain drugs for major and serious diseases are rather pricey, which often drives patients and their families into poverty. Statistics show that the 5-year survival rate of cancer patients in China is about 30%. Whereas in developed countries in Europe and the United States, the rate is between 70 to 80%. Apart from the innovative medicine swift development and the advanced medical technology in these countries, another key reason is the affordability of cancer drugs. The costly medical expenses are a challenge demanding urgent solutions in China.
In China, the main healthcare delivery institution are public hospitals, but the government funding comes less than 10%. So many of their operation money they need to earn from market. On the other side, the cost rises rapidly because we have this universal coverage. That's why the healthcare reform will keep going on. Yeah, we already finished the first step.
Step by step, China must continue to intensify its medical insurance reform to tackle the issues it's facing. From May 1st, 2018, most of the imported drugs, particularly anti-cancer drugs, have become tariff-free in China, which will reduce the price of anti-cancer drugs by up to 20%. On October 10, 2018, the medical insurance began to cover 17 additional anti-cancer drugs. The newly negotiated drug prices are on average more than 50% lower, and the payment rates for most imported drugs after negotiation are lower than the market prices in surrounding countries or regions. The Chinese government aims to provide comprehensive lifelong health care for 1.4 billion people, so they may all receive equal medical services.
Inside larger hospitals in cities like Beijing and Shanghai, you will see many people from every part of China. They come with their luggage and family, flooding the best hospitals. In the halls of these hospitals, people wait in long lines and even take up temporary residence, longing for medical treatment. The doctors are very busy, so they don't even have time to smile. Hospital is one of the craziest places in China. Oh, again, can you help me? I'm in a lot of pain here. When they get to the hospital. Really? Clinic?
In China, community hospitals see few visitors because people only trust famous doctors from large hospitals in big cities. The situation is rather widespread. Union Medical College Hospital is one of the best hospitals in China. With so many outstanding medical staff working here, the hospital once received over 10,000 patients in a day. In China, hospitals like Union Medical College Hospital, providing high standard medical care and treatment in and around the area they are based, account for only 7.7% of the total hospitals in China, but they receive 48.7% of the patients from across the country.
Indeed, if I were to put my own wish list for the next 10 years, it would include a specific attention to the disparities that exist between provinces.
But our research is finding out, in China, the income disparity is much higher than the health disparity because in the past years, government heavily invested the health and all those resources moved to the western, to those underdeveloped areas. It's improved the health status. I think this is a good sign.
If we want universal health coverage, we must be providing high quality, trustworthy primary care services with more community level professionals that are able to deal with most problems of China's health. Screening for early signs of cancer, general behavioral advice in order to reduce risk. These are all at primary care level, and they can reduce a lot the need for hospital level care.
So now we trying to integrate all the systems from public health, health maintenance, primary care, tertiary hospital, combined together. We take the responsibility for people's health.
2019 marks the 10th anniversary of a new round of intensified health and medical care reform. Over the past decade, China has achieved universal medical insurance coverage. But from a long-term perspective, China should pursue higher-level public medical insurance. So not only can the people afford treatment for minor complaints, but also for major diseases. Moreover, they should all enjoy equal medical resources of high quality. More than that, China will ensure the delivery of comprehensive lifecycle health services for people. In China, it is known as the Healthy China Strategy.
We should be proud of what is being done because, come on, 1.4 billion people is not an easy number to work with.
Healthy China is not only, we will provide the universal coverage for the people to get the treatment of diseases. I think China contribute to the world is we can find a new way for the health, not only for disease care, because the health is the goal.
Let's do this. You hear that music? On the sidewalks and in the squares, there are people dancing. You will see them dancing. They call it square dancing in China because it usually happens in the square. You know, with the growing number of elderly, it is even more important to have better medical insurance. Only with that can they continue to dance happily. How are you?
Okay. Of course, it's not perfect, and some of the things, is it working? Okay, some of the things that mentioned in the article, like for example, the hygiene, it was very difficult when I went back to rural part of China, a lot of times to find a really clean bathroom. That is an issue, but with this reform started in 2009, so that was after the article was written. And in fact, if you look at the newer articles, which I was thinking about assigning to y'all, but I decided against it. It's long and technical. It's from Lancet. So evaluating the reform, they often cite the article y'all just read. So that is to say, that article was very influential. Those certain criticisms was taken seriously. A lot of doctors were also in China that are reflecting on these issues. So the privatization certainly caused a lot of tensions between the doctors, the medical staff, clinicians, and people just kind of like what we talked about in that was the child had a fever and the parents don't trust the clinicians. A lot of the times now, because doctors have the incentive, they will get bonus from certain tests, certain medicines, newer medicines and all this stuff. So there's more of a distrust, and then there are sometimes very violent protests. And there's even, I think it was more severe a couple of years ago, a decade ago, but there were even like group people. Now that we're all capitalistic, you would have business or targets at some dark side of the humanity, like there are group of people who are hired to be doctors for you because now you're discontent, you're unhappy about it, you feel like you didn't get attention. I'll say that conflict in China is very, very intense. May have been relieved a little bit as there are people working to, like, for example, we see they referring to that movie Dying to Survive, which I posted the link. It's free for Tubi to watch. That's the link I posted on Canvas. It's an entertaining movie to watch, so probably much easier than our lectures. So you get more of a story. You can get more of the emotional impact of what it means to people. It was in 2018, I happened to be doing research in China. I didn't want to see it. I don't want to get depressed watching a medical movie. But then my friend who has families recently gone through a lot of surgeries, and she like really felt she relates to the people struggling there. So she recommended me to watch the movie. I went to watch with my husband, who is from America. And he felt like that was a pretty interesting portrayal. And also that movie gained a lot of discussion in China. There are definitely people who sees the issue in China and they're reflecting on it and trying to bridge the gap and making things better. But as I think that's what Caroline wants to talk about. As privatization happens, there are just certain consequences that are unavoidable, like the disparity in income, and then this mistrust. But I also want to say in the video clip, you see the community clinic. Yes, people don't trust to see like the local, like it's just right out of your blocks, you can walk into it. But it also provided much more affordable kind of everyday care to people. Like you have like elderly people that don't want to travel very far away. You can go to a clinic, community clinic, which because it's so close to you, you also kind of get to know them. There's like a membership whole thing. And also this is very different from the West, from America, at least, is the traditional Chinese medicine practices, which is what I'm going to talk about next. There are also practiced in the hospital. So the traditional Chinese medicine, a lot of times are herbs and plants, and those are food-based products, which we're going to talk more about it. But because now there's more Western about medicine, is most definitely dominant paradigm in China for healthcare. They also kind of make intermediate products, compromise kind of product of the traditional Chinese medicine. Is called pre-made traditional Chinese medicine. So traditional Chinese medicine is, in Chinese, it's called 中药. So this one is called a 中成药. So we added the one I'm just talking about. 成 is made or pre-made, established. Succeeded. Anyway, so each character means very different. Anyway, so traditionally, you would have to go get a recipe, kind of like ingredients you get for baking. You go to a pharmacy, this has been practiced for at least thousands of years. And then they say, get licorice, get, turtle shells, whatever. And then they would go and they get all these things and then they would have to boil it down. And it forms, when I was little, I was sick a lot. That was before, and I was in a much smaller city. I almost died apparently, according to my parents. I didn't remember, I was too little. But like, because I got sick a lot, I had to drink a lot of this traditional Chinese medicines and they're not very pleasant. They taste really bitter and it's like a watery, so you have to take your time. It's like drinking milk, except for it's just really bad. It smells bad, it tastes bad, it's just bad. I hated it, but I had to drink them. And sometimes, in your family, like my grandma, she studied traditional Chinese medicine herself, which is really funny. She's also a Chinese teacher in middle school, so the equivalent of the English teacher here in middle school. But she really loves all this traditional Chinese medicine stuff, and she kind of have certain traditions, which I'll talk more later too, that now that I just really didn't want to practice anymore, now that I'm grown, I have a saying in that. Like for example, she wanted me to eat the gallbladders of like snake or fish. I don't know where she gets it, but it's bitter. And the idea is like the bitter stuff is good for you. Bitter melon is a big deal in China too. And also I was scared a lot as a kid. This is telling you the everyday practice of the traditional Chinese medicine, just in my experience. I was a kid and I got scared. I don't want to go to sleep by myself. So she decided she's gonna do acupuncture on my fingers. And it really hurts. And so I just won't tell her that I'm scared anymore so that I don't get stabbing my fingers again. But anyway, those clinics, community clinics, are kind of like the upgraded level of barefoot doctors. Maybe if you think that way, that may be a better knowledge. But in the city. So there are trained clinicians that provide you some of this traditional Chinese medicine, 中药 care. Like, for example, when I was living in Beijing by myself, I didn't have a kitchen, really small place. And I would go see a doctor there, which another thing is that because you see all those hospitals with advanced technology and well-trained medical staff people, they're often very, very, very busy. People don't have time to smell. In fact, if you see a doctor that is in those hospitals who is not seeing patients, you probably don't want to see him. So you don't get a lot of attention. The doctors, well, there's no nurse leading you into the back of the room. The doctor, like you're waiting in line, the doctor sees you, hears you, give you medicine or instruction, you have to see the next one. But it's also much, much, much cheaper to get to see even the highest doctor in those hospitals. So in those community clinics, you can get much more attention. Sometimes, like author Kleiman talked about, he studies a lot about Chinese medicine and just the practice regarding medicine in China in general. He finds out when he used to be a doctor, he has an MD. He finds out a lot of times the patients want to talk. That's the whole thing we came up with the illness narrative, the model for what is the disease, what is the illness, the sick road, that type of thing. So a lot of times the patients really want to talk, want to have this trusting relationship. And for example, I don't know if you have go to, I think this is an extreme version, therapy. So it wouldn't work if you don't trust the person on the other end of the room to listen to you. So I think again, a lot of times the traditional Chinese medicine serves that role. The community clinics serves that role, that you can come and you can talk and you can see them regularly. And that one in particular, I was pretty grateful that they did give me all those herbal medicines, and then I didn't have to boil myself because I didn't have a kitchen. So they would boil it and then they would give it to me. And I was living in Beijing by myself. So they were kind of like a family role. So that was pretty important. Okay, so just next I'm gonna continue talking about what else. So there are a couple of kind of fundamental philosophical ideas that are important to Chinese traditional medicine and just in general in people's mind today. Even if people going to hospitals, they're seeing all the doctors, they want to be tested and on all this equipment, but this type of ideas are very deeply inside us. So you see people like in the video, people are doing the square dance. If you've ever been to any Chinese city, you know that's everywhere. Hopefully I won't end up be one of them dancing on the square. Because when you're young, you think that's kind of ridiculous, and when you're older, you all ended up there. But anyway, so this is a very common practice. So for example, the first idea, qi. Did you say shangqi? That's supposed to be qi. But traditional, more older ways before the pinyin system appeared, people kind of spell Chinese, dramatize the Chinese very differently. But qi is very important, kind of very different from what you think in the Western perspective. It means energy. It also means breath, air, gas. This is just how our language is completely different. Each character means a lot more than you may think in a single word. So people say that the best to maybe describe it is in Latin, spiritus. So it's kind of like a spiritual and an invisible type of energy that flows through you. You have to know that we developed of this idea like thousands of years ago, before any modern equipment to understand how the blood flows and how everything works, which was very surprising. I think in 2000 years ago, there is a Chinese doctor. This is recorded in our historic books. He may be a time traveler. He has a very ahead of his time ideas like having anesthesia. This is a huatu, if you were Chinese, you know. Anesthesia has this drink that if you drink, you would not feel as much pain. And then he also was talking to this famous king ruler thing, Cao Cao, if you know any Three Kingdom stories, that he had this pain and he thinks apparently he has a tumor in the brain. So he wanted to open his brain up and take the tumor out, and this is 2000 years ago. And understandably, Cao Cao got really mad. Well, he has a tumor in his head, and kind of executed him. So that's why we didn't have Western medicine to stay away. So anyway, when I say spiritual and invisible energy, I didn't mean spiritual like in a religious spiritual, but in China, the division between the spirit world is not as strictly religious as it is. You may think of it. It's more like an abstract, ineffable kind of idea. So, for example, in the idea of qi, there is when you have yin and you have yang. That's the pronunciation. So the Chinese characters actually looks very similar. This is yin, this is yang. So yang can mean the sun. Yin can mean like shade. So have you heard of feng shui? It's used in feng shui a lot. So originally feng shui and all this, they're kind of like, they're kind of consistent, they complement each other. But feng shui a lot of times back in history is tell you certain things you need to take into consideration when you're building architecture. Like for example, you don't need to build your kitchen in a spot where it gets a lot of sun because your food may got like perish really fast. It is used in feng shui a lot, but it also used in the health care explanation. We call it yang sheng or so yang means nurture. Sheng means life or living or birth. So we use this yin and yang idea a lot. So if you can, the most visual example I can give you is that if you think of a hill. So the part that is ascending, which is the north part usually, because we're in the the south part, because we're in the northern hemisphere, sorry. But that part is usually warm and bright and sunny and dry. So that's that aspect. And the yin, this part means the moon, this part means the sun. So you can kind of see the moon, the lunar is more yin. Is the other side of the hill or the mountain that is in the shade. So you can imagine it's cool, it's dark, and it's moist. And you need to notice that those are not split. Like you can't split them into two completely different things. They are both sides of the same thing. Just like now that we know, men have estrogen and testosterone. Woman has both of them too. It just a matter of which part of it you have most of it. So woman can both be yang and yin, but you have more yin, and men can be both yin and yang, but you have more of yang. So and the idea of health is in the context of harmonious. You have to have a balance and a harmonious type of sea. You have just enough, the right amount of yin and yang to kind of nurture your life. And the other idea is about Wu Xing, which is also very, very important. It kind of course, so it's translated into 5 phases. A lot of times people translate it into 5 elements, which is actually not very accurate because it reminds you of the Greek 5 elements, but they're very different. So there is that book I listed there, Expressiveness of the Body and the Divergence of Greek and Chinese Medicine. So in there, they would address more of why those, the 5 elements and stuff are quite different. So, and all this yin and yang and qi and the 5 elements, they're kind of like, if you can imagine, you know, like Einstein has devoted his life on trying to figure out the theory of everything, the theory that can connect the relativity with the Newtonian theory. So that's kind of like, people's attempt of finding pattern and finding a theory that can understand our body in the context of a cosmo, universal kind of idea. That's if you read Dao De Jing, that's like heavily conducted that way. So I would argue, this is my argument, which I made in my dissertation about tea, because what I found out is that I studied wine, and the whole system of wine is that you build on math, physics, engineering, chemistry, biology, and then it's like broke down into different categories, and then you kind of use those categories to build your theory. So that's kind of what we say reductionist kind of view. It's very useful. It's very easy to standardize. If you're interested in that, you can read about kind of the whole thing about scaling and standardization. So when you're drinking wine, you're supposed to be able to go back to the process that makes certain aroma, makes a certain. Are you old enough to drink wine yet? I'm sure you have to drink wine. For coffee, it's the same thing. You should be able to like break it down into each different thing, and then you know this and you describe it and you figure out why. However, in tasting tea, it's completely different. Like people very often relate to say something. The qi, did I not write here? the C of the T. And I was like, what is that? It could be really frustrating when you're first learning about this. Like when I go see a traditional Chinese doctor, you tell me, my kidney is more like water and all this, and then they kind of balance each other out, also connect. It's very difficult to understand for people. Like, so this is one of my arguments that, you know, the Western epistemology, which is the knowledge system, the system of knowledge, is quite different from the Chinese kind of abstract ideology, the whole system of knowledge. So as someone who is trained in more of a Western knowledge base, I was very frustrated with how people talk about tea and describe tea. And I would try to correlate it, try to use my way of parsing through it, but I realized, you know, it is not important to a lot of people. They enjoy it in the way that is abstruse, that is difficult to understand. So that's kind of to help you to understand some of the philosophies of China. So Food of China, like my discussion about tea and the 5 phases, you can find in that book, which is a really interesting, great book by Eugene Anderson, a great food anthropologist. And also then the other book I listed is particularly talking about the Yangsheng, nurturing of the life. Talk about invading, like just remember when you see in the clips, people are like working out, dancing around, using swords. That also can trace back to the time traveler doctor that I mentioned. He invented kind of the animal emulating kind of practice thing, exercise thing. If you've seen Kung Fu Panda, was that we're not too young to see it. There were like the mandas and all that. Those were kind of based on that. His idea was like we're supposed to mimic all this creatures and practice and enhance our health, nurture our body. So this is particularly hardly requested for me to talk about. It's called a moxibustion. Moxibustion is very interesting. So it kind of goes into all this idea of qi and the 5 phases and all this, just understanding your body kind of as a cosmos type of thing. But in particular, it's a markwood. Okay, I forgot the name. It's a type of I think it's a markwood type of plant that smells kind of strong that people usually, but it also gets very fine, hairy kind of thing that is very easy to burn. So you throw them into together into like a thing kind of look like this tube, and then you burn it. It burns it very slowly, and it smells very strongly. With, like get rid of the mosquitoes around you. And so it was supposed to be heating up particular spots. Then that goes to the Chinese idea of those particular spots in acupuncture that kind of correlates. I did it a couple of times. It didn't really work on me, but it also, you know, because what we talk about, like all these things are so abstruse, it is kind of really difficult for a person who is not particularly an expert in this to find a good doctor in that. But I did hear people who have very successful experiences. But mostly when I was doing this, I was like, my neck was hurting, and maybe a muscle thing may not even work on that. But my friend, her husband, we all went to high school together, and he has always been kind of chubby, much bigger than me. And then he can't lose weight for whatever reason. He went to do the moxibustion. And he lost like 20 pounds. I don't know, maybe I'm not completely sure, but again, I think at least it has something to do with this regular visit of a doctor, someone you trust, and they hear you and they listen to you, and maybe it's doing something, we don't know, but We still haven't verified in biomedicine yet, but it could be something. You can buy actually the ones on the left online. I bought some here. It's more expensive than I like. I didn't bring any, but you can like stick to certain spots on yourself and then let it burn. It leaves marks and you have to wipe it off. It smells too, but no bad smell. Okay, that's. Oh, okay. So another one that I want to show you is the Nobel Prize winner Tu Youyou. So as China went through all this traumatic experience, like sometimes we ourselves don't want a lot of things that we used to like anymore because we're just so distressed. We're like, let's get rid of this. So you can't actually meet Chinese people who don't believe in traditional Chinese medicine at all. But I think she is a very refreshing example of showing what you can do with traditional Chinese medicine. Okay, yeah, so people are still struggling of trying to understand traditional Chinese medicine. There are a lot of things that doesn't make a lot of sense to us, and you will hear very contradictory stories about it. So the last thing, I have a little bit more time that I want to talk about is some medical anthropologists in China, particularly younger generation. So not as young as you, maybe like me, or a little older. They have, and this is what I want to encourage you all to do too. Like for a very long time, there's the author claimant, and we talked a lot about. He and another American scholar studied in China, James Watson, wrote a very interesting stories about food in China. Wanted the Chinese anthropologists to study China, and even America, but it just, there's not as many as we would like, which there are lots of reasons for that. Most particularly, kind of like Jim Kemp said, our parents, a lot of people in China feel like you would have better future if you study something that is a technique, that is a skill. Even though now a lot of people say don't be a doctor anymore because it's such a high risk job. But anyway, now there are growing Chinese local scholars studying about Chinese medical system and things relating to that. They address the issue with the doctor-patient tension and mistrust in doctor-patient. Then there one that particularly interesting that I want to mention is about women's period. Hopefully that's not awkward for you. So in anthropology, we know a lot of times, a lot of culture having period, women's menstrual cycle is kind of a taboo topic. There are cultures that women are not supposed to be around other family members because she's considered unclean. So there are Chinese scholars studied like college students in China. So these are educated more like you all, your counterparts in China, and we realize they're about period, even as everybody is so caught up in the biomedicine. There are still a lot of legacy from traditional Chinese medicine, like people believe if you drink something cold, it would have cramps, which we still don't understand why we have cramps all the time, which was true. I experienced that. But then we're puzzled why, Americans growing up drinking cold water all the time and you don't have PrEPs. So there's definitely some topic to particularly research more in. And then there's another one, it's about 坐月子. I don't know if you have heard of that. So studying some Chinese state is part of as a 月, it's new. So 月子, pardon, 月子, 月 also means month. So 月子 is the month after you give birth. It does not exist anywhere else as far as I'm concerned. So this anthropologist, she was working on her PhD in China and she was supposed to go and do field work and she got pregnant. So she has no choice but to study something relating to that. And then she realizes the idea of 坐月子, which is this very obscure kind of set of practices that differs from parents to parents because they're mostly the reason you did that, of how you should take care of yourself after you give birth for a month. And she noticed that it was really particular, like there are like renowned biomedical doctors in like those good hospitals that they talk about would still want their children, their daughter to 坐月子. Like there's not a lot of scientific writings as in the validity of that, but they still want to do that. And then she kind of dived a little bit into that and uncovered that kind of is manifestation of a lot of contradictions have for families, the traditional family structures, as opposed to just to modernity. Like a lot of the modern impacts on the traditional structure of family ended up manifesting in this bodily experiences of a woman after they have children. So that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening. Out this hour, so send me an email, tell me what you think.